Okay, let's jump right in. Welcome to This Explainer, where we're going to take a magnifying glass to the tiniest, most fleeting moments of how we make decisions. We usually assume that to make a rock-solid choice, we need tons of time and just mountains of data. But what if I told you that sometimes your brain can lock onto a brilliant conclusion in literally 2 seconds? That's exactly what Malcolm Gladwell unpacks in his book, Blink: The Power of Thinking Without Thinking. It completely flips the script on those split-second impressions that govern our daily lives. So today, we're going to dig into the science and some pretty wild stories behind why we trust our gut, when we absolutely shouldn't, and how we can actually train our minds to make way better snap judgments. To really get a feel for this, picture the J. Paul Getty Museum back in the 1980s. They were offered this incredibly rare, practically pristine ancient Greek statue called a kouros. Now, the Getty didn't just buy it on a whim. They spent 14 agonizing months running rigorous scientific tests, core samples, electron microscopes, the whole shebang. And the scientists? They were absolutely positive it was genuine. But when some of the world's top art historians finally saw it in person, they felt this instant, unexplainable wave of intuitive repulsion. In just 2 seconds, they knew something was off. And you know what? They were right. It was a modern forgery. So how on earth did a 2-second glance completely demolish 14 months of hard science? To figure out how that happened, here is our game plan from Miss Explainer. First, we'll look at the power of thin slicing. Then, the secrets of the locked door. After that, we'll explore the dark side of instinct, why less information is often better, and finally, how to educate our snap judgments. All right, starting right off with Section 1, the power of thin slicing. So there's this really famous gambling experiment from the University of Iowa. They gave people 4 decks of cards, 2 red, 2 blue. The red decks had massive payouts, but also brutal game-ending penalties. The blue decks, much safer, offering slow, steady profits. It took players turning over about 80 cards before they consciously figured out the trick and could explain why those red decks were basically a trap. But here's the wild part. The scientists had hooked these players up to machines to measure the sweat on their palms. By the 10th card, 70 cards before their logical brain put it all together, their palms started sweating whenever they reached for the red decks, and they instinctively started favoring the blue ones. Their unconscious brain found the pattern and sounded a physical alarm way ahead of conscious logic. And that, right there, is thin slicing. It's not magic, and it's definitely not a superpower. It's a highly accelerated, totally automated process where your unconscious mind sifts through a situation, tosses out the useless clutter, and finds the underlying pattern in the blink of an eye. Just like the gamblers sensing the bad deck or those art experts spotting the fake statue, our brains are incredibly good at finding patterns in very narrow slices of experience. We can actually see this thin slicing applied to incredibly complex human stuff like marriage. Psychologist John Gottman set up what he calls a love lab. He brings in a married couple, gets them to discuss a point of conflict, and videotapes them for just 15 minutes. Then, his team goes through the footage second by second using something called the SPAF, or Specific Affect Coding Table, which basically assigns a number to every tiny emotional cue, like a flash of disgust or defensiveness. And the results are just mind-blowing. Gottman found that every relationship has its own unique emotional signature, kind of like marital DNA. By just measuring the ratio of positive to negative emotions in that tiny 15-minute slice, especially looking for toxic behaviors like contempt, he can predict if that couple will get divorced with an astonishing 90% accuracy. So the big takeaway here? If you know exactly what to look for, there is a massive amount of truth hidden in a very short window of time. Okay, moving on to Section 2, Secrets of the Locked Door. Let's think of your adaptive unconscious as a brilliant mental valet. It's this giant internal computer running in the background, constantly scanning your environment, setting goals, warning you of danger, and shaping your behavior. And it does all of this quietly, without ever bothering your conscious mind with the boring details, which leaves you free to actually focus on whatever is right in front of you. But here's the catch. That internal computer operates completely behind a locked door. Take legendary tennis coach Vic Braden. He realized he could instantly predict when a pro player was about to double fault on a serve, literally before the racket even hit the ball. I mean, at one tournament, he called 16 out of 17 double faults correctly. But it absolutely tortured him because he had zero idea how he was doing it. The physical evidence his brain was using was totally hidden from him. His unconscious was a tennis genius, but his conscious mind was locked out of the room.
And because we can't peek behind that locked door, we run into what's known as the storytelling problem. We hate not knowing things, right? So when we're pressed to explain our snap judgments, we just confidently invent these rational yet completely incorrect explanations. For example, people at speed dating events will list out the specific traits they want in a partner, but then they choose someone completely different and just make up a brand new reason why. We live in a world that demands logical answers, but the truth is, sometimes we just know things without knowing why we know them. So the lesson here? Don't blindly trust people's explanations for their own snap judgments. Actually, don't even trust your own.
Which brings us to Section 3, the dark side of instinct.
Let's talk about the implicit association test, or the IAT. This is a psychological test that forces you to rapidly categorize words, like pairing male or female names with concepts like career or family. And what it reveals is pretty uncomfortable. It turns out our instant automatic associations often directly contradict our conscious values. You might deeply believe in total equality, for sure, but if you've grown up surrounded by cultural stereotypes, your unconscious computer will actually hesitate when asked to pair the word female with entrepreneur. Our unconscious attitudes get shaped by our environment, regardless of what we consciously believe. Now, this dark side gets incredibly dangerous when you throw in high stress and massive time constraints. When our heart rates spike past a certain threshold, our bodies just completely revert to survival mode. We enter a state of what Gladwell calls mind blindness. It's essentially a temporary state of autism where we literally lose the ability to accurately interpret nonverbal cues, read facial expressions, or understand someone's intentions. So, when you combine that extreme arousal with split-second time pressure, people stop relying on actual evidence and fall back on those rigid, deeply ingrained stereotypes we just talked about. Gladwell looks at the tragic 1999 shooting of Amadou Diallo by 4 police officers through this exact lens. Out on a dark street, the officers' heart rates skyrocketed, panic took over, and they succumbed to the stress-induced mind blindness. They totally failed at the basic human task of reading Diallo's harmless intentions, relying instead on a dangerous instinctual panic response. It's a stark reminder that extreme stress doesn't sharpen our instincts, it can completely destroy them. Let's shift gears to Section 4. Less information is often better. To see this in action, let's look at a massive military war game called Millennium Challenge. You had Commander Paul Van Ripper leading the rogue red team against the heavily computerized, heavily resourced U.S. blue team. The blue team was bogged down in databases, massive screens, and endless analytical processes. But Van Ripper? He went the other way. He embraced spontaneity. He didn't want his commanders drowning in data. He wanted them using their intuition. He actually used motorcycle couriers to bypass wiretaps and launched a surprise attack using tiny PT boats. By empowering his team to just act on their snap judgments without overanalyzing everything, Van Ripper's intuitive red team completely dismantled the data-obsessed blue team. And, a famous grocery store experiment proved the exact same thing in retail. When shoppers saw a massive display of 24 different jams, only 3% actually bought one. But when the display was cut down to just 6 jams, 30% bought one. That's 10 times as much. Buying jam is a snap decision, right? When you force the unconscious mind to process too much information, it just freezes up. So when it comes to rapid cognition, less information is a massive advantage. Frugality really matters. And finally, Section 5, educating our snap judgments. So can we actually control and improve something that happens instantly behind a locked door? Yeah, we absolutely can. For decades, classical music orchestras were overwhelmingly male, and conductors swore up and down they were just hiring the best sound. But when orchestras finally started using blind auditions, literally just putting a physical screen between the musician and the judges, everything shifted, and women started winning spots in droves. Simply by removing the visual data that triggered unconscious bias, they controlled the environment. And by controlling the environment, they educated and controlled the cognition itself. So, pulling this all together, how do you harness the power of your own blink? First, edit your information. Stop overanalyzing and embrace the frugality of less data. Second, respect the locked door. Trust your expert instincts, even if you can't perfectly explain them because of that storytelling problem. And third, actively curate your environment. Put up your own screens to weed out toxic stereotypes before they can hijack your judgment. Ultimately, the power of knowing in the first 2 seconds isn't some magical gift bestowed upon a lucky few. It is a highly cultivated skill. Your unconscious mind is an incredibly powerful engine, but it is entirely up to your conscious mind to steer it, to protect it from bad data, and to train it through deliberate experience. So, thinking about the invisible machinery operating behind your daily choices,
What steps will you take today to educate your own snap judgments?